He was on his knees, scrubbing a floor that didn't deserve him. She stood over him in heels that cost more than his monthly rent, looked down at his daughter, 8 years old, eyes wide with wonder at the aircraft hanging above her head, and said, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear, "This is not a daycare, and this is not a place for people like you." The room went quiet. Ethan Cole didn't move, didn't flinch, just set down his mop, took his daughter's hand, and walked away. But he remembered. And so did the building. If this story hits you somewhere real, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The mop bucket had a broken wheel. It had been broken for 11 days. Ethan had submitted the maintenance request twice, once on paper, once through the digital portal that the facilities coordinator had installed 4 months ago with great fanfare and hadn't checked since. Nobody fixed it. So every morning when Ethan pulled the bucket from the supply closet at the end of Corridor B, he had to drag it across the tile in a lopsided, grinding drag that left a faint black streak across the floor he'd spent the previous morning cleaning. He didn't complain about it anymore. He'd learned that complaining about the small things at Vanguard Aerospace was like talking into a wall. The wall absorbed the sound, gave nothing back, and remained completely indifferent to the fact that you'd spoken. He just dragged the bucket. It was 6:43 in the morning when he started on the East Atrium. The atrium was the showpiece of Vanguard's headquarters, a 4-story glass and steel space where the company displayed scale models of its engine systems, framed patents going back 3 decades, and, suspended from the ceiling by thick cables, a full-sized mock-up of the Apex 7's primary exhaust housing. The thing was enormous. Maybe 30 feet long, brushed titanium with the Vanguard logo laser-etched along the flank. It cost more to fabricate than Ethan earned in 2 years. The atrium floor was polished concrete, and in the early morning, before the engineers arrived and the badges started beeping and the coffee machines kicked on, it picked up the light differently. The glass ceiling went from black to pale gray to something almost gold, and the model hanging above threw long, strange shadows across the floor. Ethan had seen it every morning for 14 months, and he still thought, if he was being honest with himself, that it was a beautiful machine. He kept that thought to himself. He was halfway through the south end, working around the base of a display case, when he heard the door. Not the main entrance. The side door from the parking structure. The one that required a level 2 badge, and that most employees used to avoid the security checkpoint line. He heard the badge beep, then the door swing, then small feet on polished concrete. He turned. Leia was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes, which was the one thing about her that sometimes stopped Ethan cold in the middle of ordinary moments. She had brown eyes that were slightly too large for her face, and they caught light the way still water does. Everything reflected, nothing held back. Right now, those eyes were pointed straight up at the suspended engine housing. Her backpack was still on. She hadn't even set it down. "I told you to wait in the car," Ethan said. "The car is boring." She didn't look at him. She was still looking at the ceiling. "Is that real?" "It's a model." "But is it real metal?" "Yeah." "How does it not fall?" "Cables. And physics." She finally looked at him. "You know how it works?" "I know how most of it works." She accepted this without asking follow-up questions, which meant she believed him, which was still, after 8 years, one of the more remarkable things about his daughter. She took things at face value when she trusted the source. She didn't need elaboration. She just needed to know he wasn't guessing. She walked across the atrium, backpack still on, and stood directly beneath the suspended housing, craning her neck back as far as it would go. "It's like a whale," she said. "A little bit. A metal whale that breathes fire." "That's one way to put it." She dropped her gaze and looked at the display case beside her. Patent filings, framed photographs, a technical diagram in blue ink behind glass. She leaned in close to the diagram, the way she did when she was trying to read something that was at the edge of her comprehension. "Dad, what's an exhaust convergence ratio?" "Where did you read that?" "Right here." She tapped the glass. Ethan set down his mop and walked over. The diagram was a cross-section of a turbofan engine, and whoever had labeled it had not been thinking about 8-year-old readers. It's the ratio between how much space the exhaust has at the beginning and how much space it has at the end when it exits the engine. A higher ratio means the gas moves faster when it comes out. Why does faster matter? Because thrust is what pushes the plane forward. The faster the exhaust moves backward, the harder it pushes the plane forward. She looked at the diagram again. Then she looked at the housing above them. So the faster it breathes out, she said slowly, the harder it can push. Basically, like when you blow up a balloon and let it go. Ethan looked at her. Yeah, exactly like that. She seemed satisfied with this. She reached out and put her small fingers against the glass of the display case, not touching anything, just close, the way kids do when they want to feel the proximity of something without actually taking it. Ethan watched her and felt, as he sometimes did in quiet moments like this, a complicated kind of ache. Not sadness, exactly. Something that sat just beside sadness without quite becoming it. He thought about a version of himself standing in a room like this 15 years ago, when rooms like this had been the whole shape of his ambition. He thought about what it felt like to understand a machine the way a musician understands an instrument, not just knowing the parts, but feeling how they breathe together. He picked up the mop. He had a floor to finish. Laya stayed through the early morning, sitting cross-legged on a bench near the wall, working through a reading assignment from her teacher, occasionally looking up at the machines. Ethan had called in the favor from Rosario, the woman who ran the daycare 3 blocks from Vanguard, who had agreed to take Laya for the morning hours. But Rosario had a dentist appointment and called him at 6:15 to say she couldn't make it. The fallback was Mrs. Peterson 2 doors down, but Mrs. Peterson was 73 and had a small dog that Leia was allergic to. So here they were. It wasn't the first time. It probably wouldn't be the last. The arrangement was fragile in ways Ethan had gotten used to managing. A network of small favors and backup plans that held together as long as nothing unexpected happened, and things were always unexpectedly happening. By 8 o'clock, engineers were filtering in through the main doors, coffee in hand, lanyards bouncing. Most of them walked through the atrium without looking at anything in it, the way people stop seeing things they pass every day. A few glanced at Leia on the bench, then at Ethan, and kept moving. Marcus Webb stopped. Marcus was a propulsion engineer, mid-30s, the kind of guy who wore the same brand of khaki pants every day in different colors and considered this a functional wardrobe. He'd worked at Vanguard for 6 years and had, over the course of 14 months, become the closest thing Ethan had to a friend in the building. Not a deep friendship, more the kind that develops from shared proximity and mutual low-key decency. That yours? Marcus asked, nodding toward Laya. Yeah. How old? 8. Marcus studied the diagram Leia was reading, upside down from where he stood. She reading the Apex 7 patent filing. She got bored of Newton's laws. Marcus laughed, a real one, surprised out of him. Does she know what she's reading? She asked me to explain the exhaust convergence ratio. Did you? Ethan looked at him. Right, Marcus said. Of course you did. He glanced at Ethan the way he sometimes did, not quite curious, not quite suspicious, just registering something that didn't quite add up and filing it away. You know, Delgado in Thermal Systems was talking about you the other day. Good things? He said, and I'm quoting, that Janitor knows more about our engine than half the people I went to grad school with. He didn't mean it as an insult. I know, Ethan said. He was going to ask you a question about the cooling loop design, but then felt weird about it. He can ask. I'll tell him. Marcus moved on. Ethan kept mopping, the atrium filled with the ordinary morning sounds of a company coming to life. He'd taken the job 14 months ago because it was available, it paid reasonably, and it required him to be on site, which was what he needed. He hadn't needed the work to be fulfilling. He'd stopped expecting work to be fulfilling around the same time he'd stopped expecting a lot of other things. Before Vanguard, there had been 18 months of physical therapy and 3 surgeries and a VA benefits process that moved like something submerged in cold concrete. Before that, there had been the accident, the word he used instead of the real word, which was the event that ended his career. He didn't talk about Valor Squadron. He didn't talk about the missions or the deployments or the commendations. He didn't wear the Wings of Valor tattoo like a badge. It sat on his left forearm, covered by his shirt sleeve, visible only when he rolled up his cuffs. He'd gotten it at 24, when he'd still believed that what you earned stayed yours. He still believed that, actually. He just no longer felt the need to show it to anyone. What he talked about was Leia's school schedule, the cost of groceries, the leak in the apartment ceiling that the landlord kept patching without actually fixing, and the ongoing matter of the broken mop bucket wheel. These were the relevant topics. Everything else was previous. The apartment was 3 rooms in Kelton, 20 minutes from Vanguard by bus, on a street that was caught between what it used to be and what it was becoming. The building had high ceilings and original hardwood that hadn't been properly finished in a decade, and the radiators worked about 60% of the time. Ethan had made it okay. He'd put up shelves for Leia's books. He'd painted her room a shade of blue she'd picked out from a hardware store sample card, standing in the aisle for 20 minutes before choosing. He'd built a small desk from a flat-pack kit that came with instructions he'd ignored because the instructions were wrong. He made it work. That was what he did. He made things work with whatever was available, and he did it without announcing it, and he kept going. Leia's mother, Diana, had been gone for 3 years. Not dead, gone, which in some ways was harder to explain to an 8-year-old than the alternative. She'd left when Leia was 5, when the financial pressure and the medical strain and Ethan's depression in the aftermath of losing his career had become something she didn't want to carry anymore. He didn't blame her for it, or if he did, he'd worked through most of that. What was left wasn't quite blame, more like a quiet recognition that people have limits, and Diana had reached hers, and at the end of the day, Leia had him, and that was enough. He made sure it was enough. Leia had asked, last spring, whether her mother was going to come back. Ethan had said he didn't know. Leia had looked at him for a long moment, and then she'd said, "Okay," and gone back to her drawing. He'd sat with that okay for a long time afterward, trying to figure out if there was more he should have given her. He still wasn't sure. But the incident happened on a Thursday, near noon. Ethan was running supplies to the second floor, extra hand sanitizer, paper towels, replacement bulbs for the corridor lighting in the north wing. Leia was with him, carrying the smaller box, which she'd insisted on. She was quiet today, the way she sometimes got when she was thinking something through, and she'd been trailing her fingers along the wall as they walked, a habit she had since she could walk. They came around the corner near the executive elevator bank, and Leia stopped. On the wall, behind glass, was a full-length photograph. A pilot in full flight suit, helmet under one arm, standing on the tarmac in front of an F-22, the sun going down behind the aircraft and throwing everything in amber. The pilot was grinning, not a posed grin, a real one, the kind you can't manufacture. Below the photograph on a small brass plate were the words, "Commander Richard Pierce, Valor Squadron, 14th Wing. Vanguard Aerospace Advisory Board, 1994 to 2018. Leia looked at the photograph for a long moment. "He looks happy," she said. "He did," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Did you know him?" "I knew of him." "Was he good?" Ethan looked at the photograph. "He was one of the best pilots I ever saw." Leia nodded, the way she did when she was accepting something she'd return to later. "Why does it say did?" "Because he died a few years ago." "Oh." A pause. "Does his family work here?" "His daughter runs the company." Leia looked around, as though the daughter might be visible from where they stood. They picked up their boxes and kept moving. They were back in the atrium by 12:15, Ethan eating a sandwich from the bag he'd packed that morning, Leia eating the other half and reading, when the elevator doors opened and Veronica Pierce walked in. She wasn't alone. She was with 2 men from the investor relations team, both of them moving fast, matching her pace, tablet in hand, mid-conversation. Ethan had seen her in the building before, usually at a distance, usually in motion. Up close, she was sharper than the distance suggested. Early 30s, dark hair pulled back without ceremony, the kind of composed that isn't comfortable exactly, but is entirely controlled. She wore the authority of this building the way some people wear expensive clothes, like it fit, and like she'd stopped thinking about it. She was talking about the Apex 7 demo timeline when she noticed Leia, or more precisely, she noticed that Leia was standing near one of the display cases again, one hand pressed to the glass, looking at a photograph of a test engine mounted on a rig. Veronica stopped walking. The two men took a few more steps before realizing she'd stopped, then stopped themselves. "Whose child is that?" Veronica asked. She wasn't asking Leia, she was asking the room. Ethan straightened. "Mine. She's with me." Veronica looked at him, then back at Leia, then at the display case, specifically at where Leia's fingers were pressing against the glass, which had left 2 small smudges. "This is not a public space," Veronica said. "This is a working facility." "I understand that," Ethan said. "She's quiet. She's not touching anything." "She is touching something. She's touching that case." She turned fully toward Ethan now. "You're in the maintenance department?" "Facilities." "Right." Something shifted in her expression. Not cruelty exactly, but a kind of categorization, quick and final. "I don't know what the arrangement is here or who approved it, but employees do not bring their children into this building. We have policies. This is an aerospace engineering facility. There are safety protocols." She's been sitting on a bench reading all morning. "I'm not interested in the details." She said it flatly, without raising her voice. Somehow that was worse than if she'd raised it. "This isn't a daycare, and frankly this isn't—" She paused, looked at Leia again, at the smudges on the glass, at the worn backpack, at Ethan in his gray uniform with the Vanguard logo on the chest. "This isn't a place for people in your position to—" She stopped herself, but just barely. She'd said enough. The atrium had gone quiet. There were 3 engineers at the far end who had stopped walking. Marcus, who had just come back through the side door, was standing absolutely still near the corridor entrance. Leia lowered her hand from the glass. She looked at her father. Ethan stood very still for a moment. He felt something tighten across his chest. Not anger, not quite, or anger that had somewhere deeper to land before it came out the other side. He had learned, in the years since the accident, that his emotions needed a longer runway than they used to. That the quick flare he used to trust had burned him enough times that he didn't reach for it anymore. He looked at Veronica Pierce. He thought about her father's photograph on the wall, about the grin, about the amber light on the tarmac. He thought about a night over the Bering Strait, cloud cover at 12,000 feet, radio silence, a twin engine going down. He didn't say any of that. He said quietly, "Leia, put your jacket on." Leia zipped her jacket. She didn't look at Veronica. She picked up her backpack from the bench and held it in front of her with both hands. Ethan collected his supply box. He looked at Veronica one more time, not with anger exactly, something more settled than anger. "I'll make sure she's out of the building by end of my break," he said. He walked out of the atrium. Leia walked beside him, one hand finding his. He didn't squeeze her hand yet. He waited until they were through the corridor door and out of earshot before he crouched down to her level. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. Her face was careful. The expression she made when she was deciding whether to be upset. "What she said wasn't about you," Ethan told her. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Leia said, but there was something small and uncertain in it. "The smudges on the glass. You know I can clean those in about 10 seconds. She almost smiled. "Did you figure out what the picture was?" he asked. "The one you were looking at?" She nodded. "It was the first test firing. The plate said 1987. "First successful test firing," he said. "You know how many failed tests there were before that?" She shook her head. 37, he said. "That engine exploded or malfunctioned 37 times before it worked, and they kept going anyway." Leia thought about this. Were people scared of the explosions? Probably. But they kept going anyway? They kept going anyway. She considered that. "Okay," she said. He stood up. He sent a text to his neighbor's daughter, who was 17 and sometimes watched Leia for $20 and a bag of chips, and she said she could be there in 30 minutes. He walked Leia to the lobby and sat with her on the bench outside until the neighbor's daughter arrived, and then he went back inside and finished his shift. He mopped floors. He replaced corridor bulbs. He dragged the broken-wheeled bucket across tile that rang with the sound of his boots, which was a sound he'd gotten used to, even if he'd never liked it. Near the end of his shift, he walked past the atrium. The glass case had been cleaned. The smudges were gone. He didn't know who'd done it. He stood there for a moment, looking at the clean glass. Then he turned and walked to the supply closet at the end of Corridor B, returned the bucket to its spot, and signed out. Outside, the sun was going sideways, and the runway lights at the small municipal field adjacent to the facility were just starting to blink on. Ethan stood in the parking lot for a moment and watched a small commuter aircraft bank against the pale sky, wheels extending, nose tilted up just slightly as it lined up on approach. He watched it all the way down to the threshold. Then he got on the bus. 3 days after the atrium incident, someone left a copy of Jane's All the World's Aircraft on the bench outside the supply closet. No note, no name, just the book, spine up, sitting on the bench like it had been there all morning, and nobody had thought to question it. It was a current edition, not a library copy. The binding was clean, the pages uncracked. Ethan picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. He looked up and down the corridor. Nobody. He took it home that night and put it on Leia's shelf without explanation. She found it before dinner and spent the rest of the evening cross-legged on her bed working through the turboprop section, occasionally calling out questions he answered from the kitchen while he made rice and defrosted the chicken he'd meant to cook 2 days ago. It was the most animated she'd been in days, and he didn't examine that too closely. He just answered her questions and let her eat at her desk because she didn't want to stop reading. He never found out who left the book. He had a suspicion, but Marcus denied it with the specific kind of denial that meant yes. The fault in the Apex 7 showed itself on a Tuesday morning, and it showed itself to Ethan first. He was cleaning the observation walkway above the test cell, an elevated corridor with reinforced glass running along one side, designed so engineers could observe ground-level procedures without being in the immediate test environment. Nobody used it much anymore. Most of the monitoring had moved to the data center. But the walkway itself needed maintenance like everything else, and it was part of Ethan's rotation. He was running a dry mop along the floor when he heard it. Below him, the engineering team was doing a systems integration check on the Apex 7 secondary fuel management assembly, essentially a rehearsal of all the inputs and handoffs that would happen in sequence during the real test. Nobody was firing anything. It was paperwork made physical, each subsystem talking to the next in a controlled, low-stakes environment. There were 4 engineers in the test cell, tablets in hand, running through their checklists. Ethan wasn't watching them directly. He was watching the fuel pressure readouts on the display panel below the walkway glass, which were visible from where he was standing, and which were showing something that shouldn't have been there. The secondary fuel line was cycling through pressure spikes at a rate that was roughly 40% above the tolerance band. Not dangerously above, not in a way that would trip the automated shutoff, but consistently and repeatedly in a pattern that, if you knew what you were looking at, suggested the check valve between the secondary and primary manifolds was seating inconsistently, which meant that under real load, under actual ignition and sustained thrust, you weren't getting a seating issue. You were getting a valve that was going to fail to close completely at the worst possible moment. He stood there for a long moment, mop handle in both hands, watching the readout cycle. Then he went downstairs. He stood at the edge of the test cell entrance, which was as far as he was authorized to go without an escort. One of the engineers, a young woman named Priya, who was maybe 26 and had the particular intensity of someone who'd graduated top of her class and hadn't slowed down since, noticed him and walked over with the expression of someone expecting a maintenance question. "Hey," Ethan said, "you running the integration check on the fuel management assembly?" "Yeah." "Your secondary line is cycling pressure spikes, about 40% above the upper tolerance limit on the check valve." Priya looked at him. There was a pause that lasted about 1 full second, which was the pause of someone deciding how seriously to take something. "You were watching the readout from the walkway?" she asked. "I could see the panel from where I was. We haven't flagged anything. The automated system won't catch it at this load level. You'd need to be watching the manual readout on a cycle-by-cycle basis." Another pause. She looked at him more carefully now. The uniform, the mop, the specificity of what he'd just said. "You want to show me what you're seeing?" He did. He walked her to the panel display and pointed out the cycle pattern, explaining the valve seating inconsistency, the way you explain something that is obvious to you and might not be to someone who is approaching it from a different angle. Priya pulled up the raw data log on her tablet, ran a quick filter, and went quiet. "That's..." She stopped. "Yeah," Ethan said. She looked at him. "How did you know where to look?" Pressure spikes that pattern usually start at the secondary to primary manifold junction. The rest of the system looks clean. That's not a maintenance issue. That's a systems integration issue. I know. She studied him for a moment longer. Then she turned and called across the test cell. Chen, pull the valve seeding logs for the secondary manifold, all of them, last 72 hours. She turned back to Ethan. Thank you, she said. It came out a little uncertain, like she wasn't quite sure what category to put this in. No problem, he said, and went back upstairs for his mop, soak. The conversation reached the engineering floor by afternoon. Ethan didn't know this directly. He pieced it together from context. Marcus stopped by the supply closet at end of shift and leaned in the doorway with the particular posture of someone who had information and was deciding how to deliver it. You told Priya Nair about the valve issue, Marcus said. She needed to know. She escalated it to the Apex 7 lead team. They're doing a full valve assembly inspection tomorrow. Brought in the chief systems engineer. Ethan stacked the replacement bulb boxes in the cabinet. Good. Ethan? What? Priya said you identified it from 40 feet away through reinforced glass by watching a manual readout during a secondary integration check. The readout was visible. That's not what I'm saying, and you know it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. She said you explained the valve seating failure pattern like someone who had seen it before, not like someone who'd read about it, like someone who had seen it before and lived with the consequences. Ethan closed the cabinet. He didn't respond to that. Nobody's asking you anything, Marcus said. He exhaled. I'm just saying that the people who matter noticed, that's all. Ethan locked the cabinet and pocketed the key. How's the integration check looking otherwise? Marcus recognized the deflection and accepted it. The rest of it's clean. They think the valve is a manufacturing defect from the third-party supplier. If it had gone through to the demo at full load, I know what it would have done, Ethan said. Marcus looked at him. Yeah, he said. I think you do. He left. Ethan turned off the supply closet light. The valve inspection took 2 days. The chief systems engineer, a heavy-set man named Kowalski, who had been at Vanguard for 22 years and had the institutional memory of the whole building stored somewhere behind his eyes, personally supervised the teardown of the secondary fuel management assembly and found what Ethan had suspected. The check valve had a micro-deformation along its seating surface, invisible to standard pre-installation inspection, that was causing inconsistent closure under cyclic pressure loading. It was the kind of defect that didn't show up in static testing. It only revealed itself in dynamic conditions, and only if you were watching the right data, and only if you understood what the pattern meant. The demo would have failed, not failed quietly, failed catastrophically, in front of military officials and investors, and every camera Vanguard's PR department had arranged to document the moment. Kowalski filed his inspection report and, at the bottom, added a note that was unusual enough to get passed around the engineering floor by end of week. Issue identified by on-site facilities personnel. Identification demonstrated advanced understanding of fuel management system dynamics. Recommend reviewing personnel qualifications on file. Nobody acted on the recommendation immediately. These things move slowly in large organizations, and the engineering team had a deadline to hit and a replacement valve to source and test, which absorbed most of the available attention. But the note existed, and people had read it. Veronica Pierce read it on a Thursday evening, alone in her office on the 4th floor, with the city going amber beyond the windows and a coffee gone cold on her desk. She read Kowalski's report twice. Then she pulled up Ethan Cole's personnel file, which took her longer than it should have because facilities staff were in a different HR system than she was used to navigating. The file was sparse. Previous employment listed as U.S. military, aviation sector, with a separation date 3 years prior. No further detail, which was normal for veteran hires, where the specific service record was either classified or just not volunteered. Educational background: incomplete, bachelor's in aerospace engineering, attended 2 years before enlisted service. She sat with that for a moment. Aerospace engineering. She looked at the date of hire, 14 months ago. She looked at the position, facilities maintenance, grade 3. She set the file down and looked out the window. The municipal airfield lights were on, the way they were every evening, and a small aircraft was on approach, wheels down, angled against the low sky. She thought about the atrium, about what she'd said, about the specific phrase she'd stopped herself from completing. This isn't a place for people in your position. And how completely, cleanly, without drama or accusation, he had walked away. She wasn't given to second-guessing herself in the ordinary course of things. She'd learned early that hesitation in leadership created space for other people's doubt to fill. Her father had taught her that. Richard Pierce had run Vanguard with a certainty that she'd spent years trying to replicate, not always successfully, not always for the right reasons, but consistently and without visible wavering. The problem was that certainty had started to feel, in recent months, less like strength and more like a habit she was afraid to break. She closed Ethan's personnel file and opened the valve inspection report again. She read Kowalski's note one more time. Then she pulled her cold coffee toward her and drank it anyway, which was something she did when she was thinking hard about something she didn't want to think about. And she sat there in the going dark until her assistant knocked on the door to ask if she needed anything before leaving. She said no. She said she was fine. She was not entirely fine, but she was functional, which in her experience was the more reliable state. The following Monday brought something Ethan hadn't expected, a formal acknowledgement. Not from Veronica. From Kowalski directly, who stopped him in the corridor near the test wing and offered his hand without any preamble. "You saved this project a serious problem," Kowalski said. He shook hands the way old engineers do. Firm, brief, done. "I've been in this industry 22 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times a maintenance worker has identified a systems-level defect from a manual panel readout during a secondary integration check." "The pattern was visible," Ethan said. Kowalski looked at him. He had the kind of eyes that had been in too many technical meetings to miss much. "Sure," he said. "Sure it was." He held the look a beat longer than necessary. "If you ever want to have a conversation about your background, my door's open." "I appreciate that." "I mean it." "I know," Ethan said. Kowalski nodded once, like something had been confirmed, and walked away. Ethan stood in the corridor for a moment after he left. He looked down at his hands, the uniform cuffs, the plain gray fabric, the Vanguard patch on his chest. He thought about what Kowalski's open door might mean if he walked through it, and what it would cost, and whether the math worked out differently now than it had 14 months ago. He didn't know. He genuinely didn't know. He picked up his supply cart and kept moving. Laya had a school presentation that week, something about flight, which her teacher said she'd chosen herself, and which had taken up 3 evenings of the kitchen table, covered in library printouts and hand-drawn diagrams that were more technically accurate than they had any right to be from an 8-year-old. She'd asked Ethan questions while she worked, and he'd answered them, and at some point on Wednesday evening he'd looked up from the dish he was washing and realized she was explaining the Bernoulli principle to herself out loud, in the specific tone people use when they're rehearsing something until it lives in their body rather than just their head. He stood at the kitchen sink for a moment, dish in hand, water running. She didn't look up. She was tracing a diagram of an airfoil with her finger, lips moving. He turned off the tap. "Laya." She looked up. "You've got it," he said. She thought about this. What if someone asks a question I don't know the answer to? Then you say, "I don't know, but here's how I'd find out." Is that allowed? It's better than pretending. She went back to her diagram, apparently satisfied. He went back to the dishes. Later, after she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he didn't really want, and thought about the open door Kowalski had mentioned, and about the valve, and about Priya's face when she'd pulled up the raw data log and gone quiet. He thought about what it felt like to see a problem clearly, to know the shape of it, to understand not just that something was wrong, but specifically and precisely how it was going to fail. He hadn't realized until Tuesday morning on that walkway how much he'd missed that feeling. He'd been so focused on being present for Laya, so focused on the practical math of their life, the bus schedule, the grocery budget, the broken mop wheel, the network of favors that held everything together, that he'd stopped noticing the slow, quiet way grief works on a person. Not the sharp grief of an immediate loss, but the other kind, the long kind. The kind that's not dramatic enough to name, that just settles into the space between who you were and who you've become, and makes itself at home there. He wasn't sure what to do with that recognition. He sat with it for a while, the way you sit with something that doesn't have a clear action attached to it. Then he washed his cup, checked the lock on the door, and went to bed. The engineering floor was still buzzing when Ethan came in Wednesday morning. He could feel it the way you can feel a current in a room that's outwardly calm. Something running underneath the normal pace of things. The kind of energy that means something is being decided or had recently been decided or was about to be. Marcus found him near the service elevator at 8:15. "They fixed the valve," Marcus said. "I know. Priya told me Monday." "Not the valve. The other thing." Marcus looked slightly uncomfortable, which was his tell for when he was about to say something he thought Ethan might not want to hear. Word got to Director Chen, the VP of Engineering. He asked HR to pull your background check and service record. Ethan was quiet. "They can't access the military record directly, not without a formal release, but there's enough in the public record that—" Marcus stopped. "Ethan, the Valor Squadron, that's a matter of public military record. The unit citations, the decorated personnel roster, I know what's in the record. Then you know they're going to find it. Eventually. Maybe sooner than that." Marcus looked at him steadily. "Is that a problem for you?" Ethan thought about it, not about what it would mean for other people. For the engineers who'd been quietly circling his desk, or for Kowalski, or for whoever at the VP level was now pulling documents. He thought about what it meant for him. Whether the exposure of a thing changed the thing itself. "No," he said finally. "It's not a problem." Marcus let out a breath. "Okay," he said. "Okay, just wanted you to know before the rumor got ahead of you." "I appreciate it. The rumor is already pretty far ahead of you, honestly." "How far?" Marcus tilted his head. "People are saying you designed the cooling loop." "I didn't design the cooling loop." "I know you didn't, but you explained the thermal gradient issue in the secondary circuit to Delgado on a lunch break 2 months ago, and he presented the correction to the team the next morning, and it worked. So." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I told him where to look. He did the engineering." "Sure," Marcus said in exactly the tone Kowalski had used. He pushed off the wall. "Have a good morning." He walked away. Ethan stood by the service elevator for a moment, listening to the building around him, the ventilation system, the distant pressure test equipment running somewhere in the south wing, the hum of the elevator itself as it descended without him. He pressed the button. The elevator came. He got in, pressed 2, and rode it up with his supply cart and his gray uniform and his name tag that said Cole above the Vanguard patch. And he thought about how strange it was that a building could hold so many versions of a person's past without knowing it, and how eventually the walls always gave up their secrets. The elevator opened. He stepped out. He had floors to clean. The demo was scheduled for a Friday. Vanguard had been building toward it for 8 months, the full public firing of the Apex 7 under simulated operational load, attended by a joint delegation from the Department of Defense Procurement Office, 3 private defense contractors who were evaluating licensing agreements, and enough financial press to fill 2 rows of folding chairs on the observation platform. The PR team had sent out materials. The catering had been ordered. The CEO's remarks had been written, reviewed, and revised twice. It was, in the language of the 4th floor, a landmark moment. In the language of the engineering floor, it was the kind of event that made experienced people quietly double-check everything they'd already checked 3 times. Ethan worked the morning of the demo the same way he worked every morning. He was on the access roads at 6:15, clearing the drainage grate near the south entrance that had been partially blocked since the last rain. The weather had turned cold overnight, the kind of early-season cold that came in without warning and made the concrete feel harder than it was. He wore gloves with the fingers cut off, a habit from years ago he'd never broken, and he could feel the temperature in the metal of the grate as he worked. By 7:30, he was inside, running his corridor rotation. The building was already different, more people, different energy, the specific kind of controlled tension that settles into a space when something is about to be evaluated publicly. Security had added 2 personnel at the main entrance. The visitor badging station had a line before 8 o'clock. He passed the observation platform setup crew in the east yard, erecting the last of the temporary seating. He passed the catering van backed up to the side entrance. He passed 3 different engineers in the corridor who were all moving fast and none of whom registered his presence. He was cleaning the observation walkway glass when Marcus found him at 9:15. "You gonna watch the firing?" Marcus asked. "I'll be on the walkway," Ethan said. "Same as always." Their standing room at the back of the press platform. Nobody would say anything. "I'm fine up here." Marcus leaned against the railing beside him, looking down through the reinforced glass at the test cell below. The Apex 7 sat in its mounting rig, fully assembled, every component that had been touched in the past 3 weeks inspected and certified. The replacement valve had been tested across 47 pressure cycles. The fuel management assembly had been re-cleared by Kowalski personally. The engine looked exactly as an engine should look before a demonstration, ready and still and slightly ominous, the way powerful things often do at rest. "They fixed the cooling shroud attachment on the starboard side," Marcus said, the one Delgado corrected. "I saw." Kowalski gave Delgado full credit in the report. "That's right," Ethan said. "It was Delgado's work." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "Director Chen is going to be at the demo, and someone from legal, and—" He paused. "HR sent a note to your supervisor. They want to schedule a meeting with you next week. Not a disciplinary thing, something about reviewing your classification." Ethan kept cleaning the glass. "Okay." "Ethan, that means they're talking about reclassifying your role." "I heard you. Is that—" Marcus stopped. Started again. "How do you feel about that?" Ethan looked at him. "I feel like I have 3 more panes of glass to clean before the demo starts." Marcus exhaled. "You're maddening sometimes. You know that?" "3 panes," Ethan said. Marcus straightened and pushed off the railing. "I'll be on the main floor, south side." He hesitated. "It's a good engine, Ethan. Whatever else, it's a genuinely good engine." "I know it is," Ethan said. The demonstration began at 10 o'clock, and for the first 22 minutes it went exactly as planned. Ethan watched from the walkway. Below, the test cell was arranged like a theater, the engine in the center, the monitoring stations along the walls, the observation platform visible through the exterior windows, crowded with officials and press, and the controlled attentiveness of people who understood, at some level, that they were watching something significant. The military delegation sat in the front row. Veronica Pierce stood at the edge of the platform, not seated, hands clasped behind her back, watching with the expression of someone who had prepared for every contingency she could name. The ignition sequence ran clean. The engine came up through its start cycle the way a well-built machine does. Not perfectly, because nothing was ever perfectly smooth under real load, but steadily, each stage handing off to the next without drama. The sound was extraordinary, even through the walkway glass, even dampened by 3 layers of acoustic insulation. The Apex 7 at partial thrust produced a sound that you felt in your sternum before you heard it in your ears. It was a physical thing, a low, sustained roar that the building absorbed but couldn't quite contain. Ethan watched the data panels on the walkway display. Fuel pressure, nominal. Exhaust temperature, within expected range. Thrust output climbing along the projected curve. He watched. He breathed. At the 22-minute mark, the display panel on the far left registered a spike. Not on the fuel management assembly, not on any of the systems that had been inspected and re-inspected and certified. It came from the primary combustion chamber monitoring loop, a temperature reading on the inner liner port side that spiked 14% above the safety ceiling in a single data cycle. 1 spike, then nominal, then 2 spikes in succession. Ethan set down his cleaning cloth. He looked at the data cycle pattern. He looked at the engine below, running at 73% thrust, and he looked at the inner liner temperature readout and felt something go very quiet inside him. The particular silence that comes when a familiar shape resolves out of noise, and you recognize it, and you understand immediately and completely what it means. The inner liner was failing, not gradually, not in a way that the automated systems would catch in time to shut down cleanly. The failure mode he was watching was a thermal runaway in the combustion zone, which meant the liner was already compromised, which meant the containment integrity of the primary chamber was degrading in real time, which meant that at the current thrust level and trajectory the next 60 to 90 seconds were going to produce, he was already moving. He hit the emergency contact panel at the end of the walkway, which was designed to alert the test cell crew directly, and he hit it hard enough that the panel housing cracked along the edge. Then he turned and went for the stairs, because the stairs were faster than the elevator, and he needed to be at the floor-level emergency shutoff before the automated system got there, because the automated system's threshold was calibrated for a different failure mode, and it was going to be late. He came off the stairs at a run and crossed the lower corridor in seconds and hit the test cell entry door. The door was locked. Standard protocol during live firing, the cell was sealed from external entry for the duration. He could hear the engine. Even out here, through two sets of reinforced doors, it was present and enormous. And somewhere inside that sound was a pitch that had been shifting for the past 40 seconds, a harmonics change in the combustion note that he registered in his body, the same way he'd learned to register it at altitude in a failing aircraft, the way certain sounds get written directly into your nervous system when the cost of missing them is high enough. He hit the entry intercom. "This is Cole, facilities. I need the cell unsealed. Inner liner temperature, port side, thermal runaway in progress. Your automated shutoff is going to be late." A pause that lasted about 3 seconds. The 3 seconds felt longer. The door unsealed. He went through. The test cell interior was louder than anything. The engine occupied the sonic space completely, the kind of sound that presses against your thinking and makes precise thought feel like swimming upstream. There were 4 engineers at the monitoring stations, all of them processing the same data spike he'd seen from the walkway, all of them in the specific paralysis that comes in the first seconds of an unexpected emergency when the gap between training and reality makes itself felt. Ethan moved to the nearest engineer, a young man whose name he didn't know, and put a hand on his shoulder. "Manual override," he said, directly into his ear. "Primary combustion shutoff. Port side liner bypass first, then full shutdown. Do it now." The engineer looked at him. "Now," Ethan said. The engineer did it. The sequence was not clean. The engine shutting down under a compromised liner was not a controlled, orderly process. It was a controlled and urgent one, with a difference that mattered. The first override command dropped the thrust to 40%. The second engaged the liner bypass, which rerouted the thermal load around the damaged section. The third began the full shutdown sequence. They were 12 seconds into the shutdown when the inner liner failed completely. Later, the incident report would describe it as a partial containment breach, which was accurate in the technical sense, the way a sentence can be accurate without being fully honest about what it felt like in the room. What it felt like was a concussive pressure wave from the port-side combustion chamber, enough force to take 2 monitoring stations off their mounts and shatter the observation window on the south wall of the test cell. A fireball, contained within the engine housing but venting through the breach, went sideways along the port mounting arm and caught the secondary fuel routing panel, which ignited. The sprinkler system in the test cell activated 14 seconds later. Outside, on the observation platform, Veronica heard the blast and did not move for approximately 2 seconds, which was how long it took her to understand what had happened. Then she moved very fast, the way people who have been raised around aviation emergencies know to move. Not toward the cell, but toward the emergency coordination point at the southeast corner of the yard, where the incident commander would be establishing response. She was already moving when someone grabbed her arm. It was the facility's emergency coordinator, a woman named Briggs, who had a radio in one hand and a head count sheet in the other. "Ma'am, we need you at the coordination point." "How many people in the cell?" 4 confirmed out. "We're accounting for—" "How many people in the cell?" Veronica asked again. 4 confirmed out. "We're looking for—" Briggs checked her sheet, pressed her radio. "We have 1 engineer unaccounted for. Young, male, test cell staff." From inside the building, through the fire door that had partially closed on its automatic hinges, they heard the engine's secondary panel still burning. They heard the sprinklers. They heard something else, or rather, they didn't hear something they should have. A fire alarm zone that should have been triggering in the east corridor was silent, which meant the fire had already jumped the zone boundary, which meant the east corridor access was compromised, which meant that the unaccounted engineer was not getting out through the standard exit. Veronica looked at the building. She looked at the smoke starting to find its way through the ventilation slots above the east wing. She looked at Briggs, who was on her radio calling for the fire unit that was already 7 minutes out. 7 minutes. She was calculating, not deciding. Or the calculation was the decision, which was how her mind worked under pressure. She was already moving toward the East Wing service entrance when she registered the figure coming out of it. Ethan Cole came through the East Wing service door carrying a young man across his shoulders. It was not a graceful or cinematic exit. He was moving fast and his balance was off. He had the engineer's full weight shifted left, and his right knee was giving him trouble. The old injury that had never fully healed, which she didn't know about yet but was about to understand. He was coughing. The engineer over his shoulders was also coughing, which meant he was conscious, which was the important thing. Ethan made it 10 steps past the service door before his knee went, and he didn't go down so much as redistribute. One knee to the pavement, the engineer coming off his shoulders in a controlled slide that got him to the ground without impact. Ethan stayed on one knee for a moment, breathing hard, one hand flat on the pavement. The fire unit pulled into the yard. Medical was there inside 90 seconds. They went to the engineer first, who was conscious and burned on his left forearm and shakier than he wanted to appear. Then they went to Ethan, who was still on one knee, not because he couldn't stand, but because he was taking a moment to let his knee tell him whether it was going to cooperate. It was during this moment, while the medical technician was crouching in front of him, asking him questions he was answering in a clipped, factual way, that his sleeve, which had ridden up during the carry, was visible to anyone standing close enough. Veronica was standing close enough. The Wings of Valor tattoo ran from his inner wrist to the midpoint of his forearm, a pair of swept wings framing a sword, the specific insignia of the 14th Wing's elite combat aviation unit, rendered in the kind of precise line work that meant it had been done by someone who understood what it represented. Below the wings, in small block letters, Valor Squadron, 14th Wing. She had grown up in aviation. She had grown up with a father who spoke about certain pilots the way other people spoke about their own families, with the particular reverence of someone who had shared the specific intimacy of aerial combat and survived it. She knew that tattoo. She had seen it on her father's arm in photographs from his service years, in the same place, the same design, before he'd had it covered with something else after his retirement, because he'd said he didn't need to wear his history on his body anymore. She stood in the yard with the fire unit working behind her and looked at the tattoo on the arm of the man who had been cleaning her floors for 14 months. She felt something happen in her chest that she couldn't have accurately named. It wasn't guilt yet. That would come later, slower, with more weight. What she felt right now was something closer to vertigo, the specific kind that comes not from height, but from a sudden radical shift in perspective, when the thing you have been looking at reassembles itself into something you didn't see before, and you understand that you were the reason you couldn't see it. The medical technician was asking Ethan to follow his finger. Ethan followed his finger, and then he said, "I'm fine. Check Reyes first." That was the engineer's name. Reyes, she would learn. 24 years old, 2 months on the Apex 7 team. Ethan had known his name, of course he had. She thought about the atrium. She thought about what she had said. She thought about this isn't a place for people in your position, and how she hadn't even finished the sentence, and how he hadn't needed her to. The fire unit was inside the East Wing. The smoke was thinning in the yard. Someone from her communications team was moving toward her with a tablet and an expression that meant the phones were already ringing. She stood in the yard and looked at the tattoo until Ethan's sleeve slid back down, and then she looked at his face, and he was looking at her. He didn't say anything. He wasn't angry. That was the thing that hit her hardest. He wasn't angry. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you've already processed the hard part of something on your own time, when there's nothing left to prove and no performance left to give. She looked away first. Word moved through the building the way it always moves in the aftermath of something serious, fast, imprecise, layered with whatever each person had seen or heard or been told. By afternoon, the engineering floor knew that Ethan had identified the thermal runaway from the walkway before the automated systems flagged it, that he'd called the manual shutdown sequence in the correct order, that he'd gone into the east corridor when the fire jumped the zone boundary, and that he'd carried Reyes out on his back with a bad knee. They also knew about the tattoo. Someone who had been near the medical response had described it. Someone else had looked up the Valor Squadron in the public military records. A third person had done the math on the 14th Wing's decorated personnel roster and the separation date in Ethan's personnel file and said quietly to Marcus in the corridor outside the engineering bullpen, "Is he who I think he is?" Marcus had said, "I think so." The person had stood with that for a moment. Then they said, "And he's been cleaning our floors." Marcus had not answered that part. Kowalski found Ethan in the medical bay at 2 in the afternoon. Ethan was sitting on the edge of an exam table with his knee wrapped and a cup of water in his hand, waiting to be cleared. Reyes was in the adjacent bay, sedated, his arm bandaged from wrist to elbow. He was going to be okay. The doctor had said it twice, which was the medical version of certainty. Kowalski came in and stood in the middle of the room and looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who had something to say and was taking a moment to figure out the right order for it. "You knew the shutdown sequence," he said finally. "Yes." "You knew the correct portside bypass before full shutdown. That's not in the public documentation for this engine." "No," Ethan said. "It's not." Kowalski was quiet. Then, "The Valor Squadron's 14th Wing. I looked it up this afternoon. There was a pilot, a decorated combat pilot, who was medically separated 3 years ago after an aircraft recovery operation over the North Pacific. His aircraft sustained significant structural damage during the recovery. He brought it in on manual control with compromised hydraulics and a portside engine running at roughly 30% capacity." Ethan looked at his water cup. "The pilot's name was redacted in the public citation," Kowalski said. "But the unit is named, the date is named, the aircraft type is named." He paused. "And the citation notes that the pilot had previously served as a technical consultant on engine system testing protocols for the 14th Wing's evaluation of advanced turbofan variants." Ethan said nothing. "Were those the Apex class variants?" Kowalski asked. Ethan looked up at him. "Second generation," he said. "The Apex 7 is third generation. Different combustion liner design. But the portside thermal failure mode is similar enough that the shutdown sequence transfers." Kowalski absorbed this. He sat down on the chair beside the exam table, which was a thing men of his particular bearing only did when they had stopped performing and were just being present. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. "When you hired on, why not say, 'I needed a job that let me be available for my daughter,'" Ethan said. "I wasn't looking to restart a career. I wasn't looking for recognition. I needed something steady and present." He paused. This was steady and present. Kowalski looked at him for a long time. "Reyes is going to be okay," Ethan said. "I know." That's the thing that mattered today. Kowalski nodded slowly. He pressed his hands on his knees and stood. At the door, he turned back. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've worked with engineers who went to the best programs in the country who wouldn't have seen what you saw this morning. Not because they weren't smart, because they hadn't learned yet that machines have personalities, that they tell you things before they fail if you've spent enough time listening." He shook his head slightly. "You've been listening to engines your whole life." He left. The medical bay was quiet. Ethan finished his water. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. The fluorescent lights, the acoustic tiles, the ordinary materiality of a room that had no particular weight to it. He thought about a sky over the North Pacific, cloud cover breaking at 9,000 feet, a twin engine with a portside combustion breach and hydraulics at 15%, the specific smell of burning insulation and the way the stick felt when the hydraulic pressure was almost gone, just the raw mechanical linkage left, just weight and will. He thought about the decision he'd made in that cockpit, not the technical decision, the other one, the one underneath it, the one that said, "You stay in this machine and you bring it in because there is a crew aboard this aircraft, and the math of who gets to survive this is not yours to do alone." He'd brought it in. He'd paid for it in the ways he'd paid for it, in bone and cartilage and the 3 years of aftermath. And then he'd gotten up and made rice and answered his daughter's questions and dragged a broken mop bucket across a tile floor. He looked at his hands. The medical technician came in and told him his knee was cleared for light duty, no stairs for 2 days. He said thank you. He asked once more about Reyes. The technician said he was stable. Ethan put on his jacket, carefully, working the sleeve over the wrapped knee. Outside the medical bay window, the test yard was quiet. The fire unit had cleared. The East Wing service door was taped off with yellow maintenance tape. The observation platform chairs were still in their rows, empty now, a program booklet caught under one leg, moving slightly in the wind. He looked at it for a moment, then he picked up his jacket and walked out. The weekend after the demo passed quietly, which was the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Ethan stayed off his knee the way the medical technician had told him to, which meant he spent most of Saturday at the kitchen table while Leia drew diagrams of what she called her dream airplane, a hybrid design that combined features she'd assembled from memory across weeks of reading, some of which were aerodynamically sound and some of which were not, and which he corrected gently when she asked and left alone when she didn't. She was particular about unsolicited feedback. He'd learned that early. Sunday he called his sister in Phoenix, which he did every 2 weeks and usually kept to about 20 minutes. She asked how his knee was, and he said fine. She asked how Leia was, and he said good. She asked how work was, and he paused for slightly too long, and she said, Ethan, in the specific tone she'd been using since they were teenagers, the one that meant she was not going to let him manage her the way he managed everyone else. There was an incident at the facility, he said. I know. I saw it on the news. He hadn't thought about it being on the news. He should have. There had been press on that platform. They're saying someone saved an engineer, his sister said. They're not naming him, but the company statement said it was a Vanguard employee. A pause. Was it you? It was handled. Ethan. He's okay. The engineer is okay. His sister was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, but less defended. Are you okay? My knee is a little swollen. That's not what I asked. He looked at the window. Outside, the street was doing its ordinary Sunday things. Someone walking a dog, a kid on a bike, the corner store with its hand-lettered sign. The radiator clicked on and off behind him. I'm okay, he said, and he meant it, mostly. I'll call you next week. He heard her decide not to push. Give Leia a hug from me. He did. Leia said Aunt Carol smelled like oranges, which was a reference to something Carol had done during a visit 2 Christmases ago involving orange-scented lotion that had apparently been formative. That evening, after Leia was in bed, he sat with his knee elevated and thought about Monday. He thought about the HR meeting that had been mentioned before the demo, which had presumably not been canceled by the fact of the demo itself. He thought about Kowalski's voice in the medical bay. He thought about Veronica Pierce standing in the yard, looking at his forearm. He didn't know what Monday would look like. He'd stopped predicting Monday a long time ago. Monday looked like this. He arrived at 6:40, stowed his bag in the supply closet, and found a note on his cart from his supervisor, a mild-mannered man named Garrett, who communicated primarily through handwritten notes, asking him to come by the facilities office before starting his rounds. He went to the facilities office. Garrett was there, looking slightly uncomfortable in the specific way of people who are aware that something has passed beyond their jurisdiction. You've been asked to go to the 4th floor, Garrett said. Conference room B, 8:30. Okay. I don't know the details, Garrett said. They told me it was an HR and leadership matter. He paused. Are you in trouble? I don't think so. Garrett nodded, relieved. He was a decent man who genuinely did not want anyone who worked for him to be in trouble. Your knee all right? Getting there. Take the elevator. Don't let me catch you on stairs. He took the elevator. Check. Conference room B on the 4th floor was a glass-walled room that looked out over the east yard. The same yard where the observation platform had been set up, which was now cleared. The chairs gone, the yellow maintenance tape on the east wing service door still visible from the window. The tape had been there since Friday. Ethan noticed it when he came in. He didn't know if anyone else in the room had. There were 4 people at the table. Director Chen, VP of Engineering, whom he'd seen at company-wide meetings but never spoken to directly. A woman from HR named Patterson, mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain, the specific neutral expression of someone who had been in many rooms where difficult things were being carefully navigated. Kowalski, who gave him a brief nod. And Veronica Pierce, who was seated at the head of the table and who looked at him when he came in with an expression that was composed and direct and gave away very little. He sat down. Nobody had told him to sit, but the chair was there, and standing would have been strange. "Mr. Cole," Veronica said, "thank you for coming in." "Sure," he said. Patterson slid a folder across the table. It had his name on the tab. "We've been reviewing your personnel file in light of recent events," she said. "There are some things we'd like to clarify." He looked at the folder but didn't open it. "Okay." "Your service record," Director Chen said. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. He was a direct man, Ethan sensed. Not warm exactly, but not interested in indirection either. "When you were hired, the information provided listed your previous employment as U.S. military aviation sector. That's accurate. But it's also incomplete," Kowalski said. Chen nodded. "Incomplete. We've done some research, not into the classified portions of your service. We don't have access to those, and we're not asking for them. But there's enough in the public military record to understand that your background is substantially different from what a Grade 3 facilities classification would typically represent." Ethan said nothing. "The Valor Squadron," Chen continued, 14th Wing. "You were on the decorated personnel roster, the public citation for the North Pacific Aircraft Recovery Operation. That was you." It wasn't a question. Ethan didn't treat it as one. "Yes." A brief silence. Patterson made a note. "You also served as a technical consultant on advanced turbofan evaluation protocols," Kowalski said, "including early Apex-class variants." "Second generation," Ethan said. "I mentioned this to you Friday." "You did." Kowalski glanced at Chen. "I wanted it on record." Veronica had not spoken since her opening. She was watching him across the table with the attentiveness of someone trying to understand something they should have understood earlier, which was a specific kind of attention. Focused and slightly effortful, like reading in a language you know but haven't used in a while. "Can I ask you something directly?" she said. "Yes." "Why did you apply for a facilities position, with your background, with your qualifications?" She paused. "You could have applied to any number of roles here, or at any other company in this industry. Why this?" He looked at her. He had thought about how to answer this question if it came, and what he'd decided was that the honest answer was the only one worth giving, because the careful answer would require him to manage her impression of him, and he was tired of that particular work. "My daughter needed stability," he said. "Consistent hours, predictable location, the kind of job where I could handle school schedule changes and doctor appointments without needing to negotiate with a team or a deadline." He paused. "Facilities maintenance isn't glamorous, but it's present. I could be present. That mattered more than the title." Veronica held his gaze. "And the work itself?" "You spent 14 months. "I spent 14 months doing work that needed to be done," he said. "I don't have a problem with the work. I never did." The room was quiet for a moment. "Reyes asked about you," Kowalski said. "Yesterday. He asked who carried him out. How's he doing?" "He'll be off rotation for 6 weeks. Arm is healing." Kowalski looked at him steadily. "He wanted me to say thank you." Ethan nodded. Patterson cleared her throat gently. "I want to address the reclassification," she said. "Given what we now know about your background, we believe your current classification significantly misrepresents your qualifications and, frankly, what you've been contributing to this facility." She opened her own folder. "We'd like to discuss a role that more accurately reflects—" "Before we get to that," Veronica said. Patterson stopped. Veronica had been looking at the table. Now she looked at Ethan. She did not perform this. She did not set it up or frame it. She just said it. "I owe you an apology." He didn't respond immediately, which she seemed to have anticipated. "The atrium," she said. "What I said to your daughter, what I implied about you." She paused. "It was wrong. I knew it was wrong while I was saying it. I said it anyway, which is worse." Another pause. "I've been trying to figure out why I said it, and the most honest answer I can give is that I had already decided what you were before you walked into the room, and I used the first opportunity available to make that decision visible." She said this without flinching, which was the only thing that made it bearable to hear. That's not a habit I'm proud of. It's one I'm aware of, which is a different thing. Ethan looked at her. I should have said this sooner, she said. I didn't. I'm saying it now. He thought about Leia's face in the atrium, the careful expression, the decision she was making about whether to be upset. He thought about what he'd told her afterward. What she said wasn't about you. He'd believed that when he said it. He still believed it. It hadn't been about Leia. It had been about Veronica and the story she'd been telling herself about who belonged where and why. I appreciate that, he said. Is that all you're going to say? Were you looking for more? She held his gaze. No, she said after a moment. I suppose not. Patterson moved them back to the reclassification conversation, which was the practical part of the morning and took another 40 minutes. Director Chen laid out what they were proposing, a senior technical advisory role attached to the Apex 7 program and the next generation development track, with a scope that would evolve as they understood better what he was willing to contribute. It was not a fully formed offer. They were honest about that. The specifics of compensation and title and team structure would need to be worked out, but the intent was clear, and Chen presented it the way engineers present proposals, directly, without excessive salesmanship, confident in the merit of the thing itself. Ethan listened. He asked 3 questions: what the schedule flexibility looked like, whether there was a remote work component for certain days, and whether the role would require travel. Chen and Patterson exchanged a brief look. These were not the questions they'd expected. The schedule flexibility is negotiable, Patterson said. The remote work we can structure. Travel would be occasional, some testing milestones, potentially some government coordination, but not frequent. Ethan nodded. He said he'd think about it. He said he appreciated the conversation. He stood, and Chen stood, and they shook hands, and Kowalski gave him the same brief, firm handshake as before. Veronica walked him to the door. In the corridor just outside Conference Room B, she stopped him. Can I ask you one more thing? She said. Not for the meeting, just personally. He waited. My father, she said. Richard Pierce. She said it carefully, like she was checking the weight of it. You said, in the atrium. You told your daughter you knew of him, that he was one of the best pilots you'd ever seen. He was. Did you know him? Ethan looked at her. He thought about how to answer this, and what the honest shape of it was, and whether she was asking because she needed to know, or because she needed to hear it said by someone who had been in the same sky. I flew with him, Ethan said. Not in the same aircraft, but there was a night, a recovery operation, North Pacific, years before the one in the citation. He was running the air coordination that got our crew home. He paused. He was the kind of pilot who made everyone around him sharper, not because he was showing off, because he was completely present and he expected the same from everyone else. He looked at her. You reminded me of him, in the atrium when you walked in. Not the words, the way you occupied the room, the certainty. She absorbed this. He watched something move across her face. Not grief, or not only grief. Something more complicated. The way you feel when you're told something you needed to hear and didn't know you needed until you heard it. He would have been disappointed in me, she said quietly, for the atrium. Maybe, Ethan said, but I don't think that's the interesting question. She looked at him. The interesting question, he said, is what you do with the disappointment, whether it's a wall or a door. He said it without weight, without lecture, just as a thing he'd learned the hard way and had not yet finished learning. She nodded slowly. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He went back to his cart. He wasn't naive about what was coming, the reclassification process, the conversations, the adjustments. It wasn't going to be simple. Organizations don't reroute easily, and people who had spent 14 months seeing him one way were going to need time to see him differently, and some of them were never going to fully make the transition, and that was human, and he understood it. He also understood that saying yes to the advisory role meant returning to something he'd walked away from, which was not the same as walking back into the thing he'd lost. It was a different version of the same territory. He wasn't sure yet what it would ask of him. He cleaned his corridor rotation. His knee ached steadily, a low background frequency he'd gotten used to tracking. Around midday, he took a break in the East Corridor and sat on the bench outside the supply room with his lunch, and Marcus appeared within about 4 minutes, which was about what he'd expected. "How was the fourth floor?" Marcus asked. "Productive. Are you taking the role?" "I'm thinking about it." Marcus sat beside him. "For what it's worth, the team would—" "I know," Ethan said. "I haven't finished. You were going to say the team would be glad to have me." "I was going to say the team would be terrified of you for about 2 weeks and then they'd get over it." Marcus looked at him sideways. "That's a compliment." Ethan ate his sandwich. "Priya asked if you were coming to the post-incident technical review," Marcus said. "It's Thursday. She put your name on the attendee list, provisionally. She said to tell you, but she said provisionally, very specifically, like it was important that you understood it was provisional." "Priya's thorough." "She really is." Ethan looked down the corridor. The East Wing service door was still taped at the far end. He'd need to replace some of the floor composite down there once the structural assessment came back. Fire suppression systems left their own kind of damage. He'd already mentally mapped the repair sequence. He noticed he'd done that without thinking about it. The mental mapping. The automatic assessment of what needed to be done and in what order. He'd been doing that for 14 months. He'd just been doing it with mop handles and corridor bulbs instead of fuel management assemblies. The instinct was the same. The application had been smaller. He finished his lunch and stood up. "I'll be at the technical review," he said. Marcus nodded. "Good. Tell Priya to take my name off the provisional list." Marcus almost smiled. "I'll tell her." The thing that Ethan hadn't expected came on a Wednesday, 4 days after the fourth floor meeting. He was in the parking structure doing a maintenance check on the emergency lighting circuit. Routine work, nothing dramatic, when his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He answered. "Mr. Cole." A woman's voice, precise and measured. "This is Catherine Ash. I'm the director of the DoD Procurement Liaison Office. We were present at the Vanguard demonstration last Friday." He sat down on the edge of the equipment case. "Yes," he said. "I'll be direct," she said. "We were briefed on the events of that morning, the shutdown sequence intervention, the personnel recovery." A pause. "We were also briefed on your service record, the portions accessible through public channels. I understand there's a reclassification conversation underway with Vanguard leadership." "There is." "I wanted to reach out before that process concluded," she said. "Not to intercept it. I want to be clear about that. But the procurement office has an ongoing interest in advanced turbofan testing protocol development, and your specific background, both the operational experience and the evaluation consulting you did for the 14th Wing, is relevant to some work we're trying to move forward." She paused again. "I'm not making an offer. I'm extending an invitation to a conversation." Ethan looked at the emergency lighting panel in front of him. The third circuit breaker from the left had a hairline crack in the casing that would need replacing before the end of the month. "What kind of conversation?" he asked. "The kind where we talk about what the next several years of advanced propulsion testing might benefit from, and whether there's a role for someone with your particular combination of skills and experience in helping to shape that." He was quiet for a moment. "My daughter is 8, he said. "She needs consistent pickup from school by 3:15 Monday through Friday." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Mr. Cole, I've been doing this work for 19 years. You would not believe the number of people who've never once mentioned their child in a first professional conversation. Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It's actually the most clarifying thing anyone has said to me in a while." A brief pause. "I think we can work with 3:15. He said he'd call her back by end of week. She said that was fine. She said she appreciated his time. He hung up. He looked at the cracked circuit breaker casing for a long moment. Then he took out his maintenance log and wrote it down. The breaker number, the fault type, the estimated replacement window. He wrote it down in the same handwriting he always used, in the same log he'd carried for 14 months, and he put the log back in his pocket. He finished the lighting check. He went home on the bus at 5:15 and found Leia at the kitchen table with her school reading, though she'd pushed it aside in favor of the Jane's book, which she'd apparently brought out again and was comparing to a diagram she'd drawn from memory. "Dad?" she said, without looking up. "What's the difference between a bypass ratio and a pressure ratio?" He set his bag down. He took off his jacket. "How much time do you have before dinner?" he asked. She looked up. She could tell from whatever it was that children read in their parents' faces before they're old enough to know they're doing it, that something had shifted. Not dramatically. Just the way a room shifts when the light changes and everything is the same, but the shadows fall differently. Enough time, she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Okay, he said. So, bypass ratio. She leaned forward. Outside, the street ran its ordinary evening course. The radiator clicked. The building settled. A commuter aircraft cut a slow line across the sky above the rooftops, wheels just beginning their descent. The sound of it reaching the kitchen window as something distant and then not distant, present, close, alive. Leia didn't hear it. She was focused on her father's hands as he pulled the book toward him and opened it to the right page. Ethan heard it. He heard it the way he always heard aircraft. Completely, instinctively, the whole shape of the sound registered and cataloged before he'd made any conscious decision to listen. He heard it, and he knew from the engine note that it was a twin prop on approach, probably the 7 o'clock commuter from the regional hub, right on time. He didn't look up. He looked at his daughter, who was waiting for him to explain something she wanted to understand, and he started talking. The reclassification paperwork took 3 weeks to process, which was faster than Ethan had expected and slower than HR had promised, which put it squarely in the range of normal for large organizations trying to move something that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. He spent those 3 weeks in a kind of in-between state, still on the facilities rotation, still dragging his cart through the corridors each morning, but now attending the Thursday technical review meetings in Conference Room A on the second floor. Sitting at the end of the table in his gray uniform while engineers and business casual presented failure analysis data and post-incident recommendations. Nobody made a production of his presence. Priya had removed the provisional tag from his name on the attendee list and replaced it with nothing, which was the correct replacement. Kowalski deferred to him twice in the first meeting on questions about thermal failure modeling, casually, without ceremony, the way you defer to someone whose answer you already trust. The engineers adjusted. It took about a week and a half, which was faster than Marcus had predicted. The mop bucket wheel got fixed on the second Tuesday. Ethan came to the supply closet and found the bucket with a new wheel, properly seated, no wobble, no note. He stood there for a moment, then put the bucket back and went to get his cart. He told Leia about the job change on a Sunday morning, over breakfast, in the direct way he told her things because she was 8 and had been navigating complexity her entire conscious life, and he had stopped protecting her from information and started just giving it to her clearly. "You're going to be an engineer?" she asked. "A technical advisor. It's a little different." "What does that mean?" "It means I help the engineers figure out problems they're having trouble seeing." She considered this while eating her toast. "Like you did with the valve thing." "How do you know about the valve thing?" "Marcus told me. When he came to pick up those books he lent you." Ethan made a note to have a conversation with Marcus about information management. "Yeah," he said, "like the valve thing." "Will you still be in the same building?" "Same building." She nodded, satisfied. Then, "Will you have to wear a different uniform?" "Probably regular clothes. Like everyone else." She looked at him. "I like the uniform," she said, with the specific honesty of children who have not yet learned to soften assessments that might be inconvenient. "You look like someone who knows how to fix things." "I'll still know how to fix things." "It's not the same," she said. He laughed. A real one, caught off guard, the kind that came up before he could manage it. She looked pleased with herself. "Eat your toast," he said. And his first official day in the advisory role was a Monday in early November, which came in cold and clear, the sky the specific shade of pale blue that only showed up in late autumn, like the atmosphere had been rinsed clean overnight. He wore a navy sweater and the same boots he'd worn every day for 14 months, because the boots were good boots, and there was no reason to replace them on account of a job title. He rode the elevator to the second floor instead of taking the stairs to the supply closet, and the difference was small and enormous at the same time, the way most real changes are. His workspace was a desk in the open engineering bay, not an office, which he'd requested because he worked better with proximity to the people he was advising, and walls created a distance that he didn't think served the work. Priya had set up his workstation with the access credentials and software he'd need, and she'd done it without being asked, which told him something about her that he already suspected. She was organized in the way of people who understand that the quality of a system's output depends on the quality of its inputs, and who apply that principle to everything, including other people's desk setups. "Your credentials are active," she said when he sat down. "The Apex 7 post-incident file is on the shared drive. I flagged the sections that need the most attention." "Thank you." "The combustion liner supplier sent their root cause analysis this morning. I haven't read it yet." "I'll look at it first." She nodded and went back to her own desk. He opened the file. He read for 2 hours without stopping, the way he used to read technical documentation in the service. Completely, from start to finish, not skimming, not jumping ahead, because you didn't understand a system by reading only the parts that looked relevant. You understood it by reading everything and letting the whole picture assemble itself. At 10:30, Kowalski stopped by his desk. "How's the liner analysis?" "Their root cause identification is correct, but their proposed remediation is incomplete," Ethan said. "They're addressing the manufacturing tolerance on the liner material, but not the thermal cycling protocol in the assembly testing phase. The defect would have been catchable earlier with a different testing sequence." Kowalski pulled a chair over and sat. "Show me." He showed him. They spent 40 minutes on it. By the end, Kowalski had sent 3 emails and scheduled a call with the supplier's engineering team for Thursday. That was the first day. The conversation with Catherine Ash and the DoD liaison office moved slowly and carefully, the way government conversations move, with a lot of calendar coordination and a lot of documents being reviewed before anything was said directly. Ethan was patient with it. He'd learned patience in the specific school of having no alternative, and by now it was genuinely his, not just a posture. What emerged over 6 weeks of intermittent conversation was a consulting framework, a formal arrangement through which he could contribute to the DoD's advanced turbofan testing protocol project on a part-time basis, coordinated with his vanguard role, with scheduling that respected the 3:15 school pickup constraint that he had named in their first conversation and that Catherine Ash had apparently written down, because she referenced it in every subsequent scheduling discussion without him having to raise it again. He signed the framework agreement on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room at the Vanguard facility, with Veronica Pierce as a co-signatory on the Vanguard side of the arrangement. She signed without comment. He signed without comment. Patterson notarized. Kowalski, who had no formal role in the signing, was there anyway, standing by the window with his coffee, because Kowalski had apparently decided to be present for the significant moments in Ethan's professional life, whether or not he was invited. Afterward, in the corridor, Veronica fell into step beside him. "How's your knee?" she asked. 70%, he said. "Does it get back to 100? The doctor says 85 is realistic. I've stopped arguing with the doctor." She was quiet for a moment. They walked toward the elevator bank. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "About my father." He waited. "That he would have been disappointed in me, for the atrium. You said maybe." She looked ahead. "I've been thinking about the maybe." "What did you decide?" "I decided you were being generous." She said it without self-pity, just as a factual assessment. He had a very specific intolerance for people who used their position to make smaller people feel smaller. He called it the worst kind of cowardice, hiding behind authority when you don't have the actual courage to justify it. "He said that to you?" "He said it to anyone who would listen, including me when I was about 12 and had been unkind to a kid in my class." She paused. "I thought I'd grown out of it. I hadn't. I'd just gotten better at rationalizing it." Ethan looked at her sideways. "You know, most people in your position after something like the atrium would have moved on, written it off, found a reason why they were technically right." "I thought about it," she said frankly. "I know you did." She looked at him. "Is that obvious?" "You waited 3 weeks before the apology. That's not procrastination. That's someone working something out." She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she might be offended, but she wasn't. She looked, if anything, slightly relieved, like being seen clearly by someone who didn't need anything from her was its own kind of rest. The elevator came. They both got in. I want to do something with this, she said, as the doors closed. With what happened, with what the demo failure revealed about where we are as a company and who we've been overlooking and why. She pressed 4. He pressed 2. I've been drafting something. I don't know yet if it's viable. What kind of something? An education program. Aviation, aerospace, technical foundations, targeted at kids from lower-income backgrounds, junior high, high school. Something that builds a pathway into the industry that doesn't require the family to already be in the industry. She looked at the elevator doors. There are kids who would be extraordinary in this field, who never get near it because nobody builds them a door. Ethan was quiet. You can tell me it's impractical, she said. I know the operational challenges. I wasn't going to tell you it's impractical. She looked at him. I was going to tell you that if you build it, it should have simulators, he said. Real ones, not consumer hardware. Kids need to feel the actual control response of a real system. That's the thing that turns interest into conviction. She stared at him for a moment. I've been thinking about this for a long time, he said. Not exactly this, but something in this direction. Something for kids who look at an engine and feel what I felt when I was 12 years old and couldn't explain why it mattered so much to them, and couldn't find anyone to explain it back. The elevator opened at 2. He stepped out. Ethan, she said. He turned. Will you help me build it? He looked at her. He thought about the answer and whether he had it yet, and what it would mean to say yes to something that was not a repair or a recovery, but a construction. Something made from intention rather than necessity. Yes, he said. The doors closed. Ok. Building the thing took longer than either of them expected and shorter than anyone in the finance department considered reasonable. Veronica approached it with the same controlled intensity she brought to everything, which meant it moved even when it moved imperfectly. She made decisions quickly and revised them when they were wrong, which was more often than she was used to and less often than Ethan had feared. She was not, it turned out, incapable of being wrong. She was incapable of pretending she hadn't been, which was a different and more useful quality. They argued about the name early. She wanted something that incorporated Vanguard's brand. He said the program shouldn't carry a corporate name because it would signal to the kids they were recruiting that it was a marketing exercise rather than a real investment. She pushed back. He held his ground. She sat with it for 3 days and came back and said he was right, which cost her something visible and which she did anyway. They named it the Valor Foundation. He hadn't suggested it. She'd come to it herself on a Tuesday morning and set it quietly across his desk like she was testing the weight of it. He'd looked at her. Is that okay? She asked. Yeah, he said. It's okay. She nodded and wrote it down. The foundation's pilot location was a converted warehouse space 12 minutes from Vanguard, close enough to use the facility's technical resources, independent enough to feel like its own thing. They spent 4 months getting it into shape. The simulators, 4 of them, real systems sourced through the DoD liaison connection that Catherine Ash had helped negotiate at a cost that was still substantial but workable, were installed in February. The workshop space took longer because the ventilation system required a rebuild that nobody had budgeted for correctly, which was the kind of thing that happens when you're converting a warehouse and someone on the facilities assessment team underestimates airflow requirements, a mistake that Ethan caught during a walkthrough, and that set the schedule back 6 weeks, and that he did not say he told anyone so, though Marcus told it for him at least once. Priya volunteered to run the technical curriculum development. She did it on top of her Vanguard workload, staying late 3 nights a week, and she built something that Ethan reviewed and returned with a single note. It was too focused on theory and not enough on the feeling of understanding. She looked at the note for a long moment. Then she rewrote 3 sections from scratch, and the revised version was substantially better, and she sent it back to him with 1 line. I think I see what you meant. He wrote back, you did. The hiring for the foundation's teaching staff took longer than the equipment. Getting qualified people who could work with kids from difficult backgrounds and explain complex systems without talking down or oversimplifying was not the same pool as getting qualified engineers. Ethan interviewed every candidate himself, not for technical qualifications, which were checked separately, but for one specific thing. Could they remember what it felt like not to know something? The ones who couldn't, who answered every question from the position of already having the answer, he passed on. The ones who could still locate the experience of confusion, of genuine not knowing, and talk from there, those were the ones he called back. He hired 7 people over 3 months. Not one of them had a conventional resume. Laya turned 9 in March, and Ethan took her to the foundation space on a Saturday 2 weeks before the official opening because she'd been hearing about it for months and had started asking specific questions about the simulators that suggested she was working from incomplete information and was ready for a first-hand update. She walked through the space with her hands in her pockets. The way she walked through things she was taking seriously, her head moving slowly, left to right like she was reading the room. She stopped at the first simulator, a full-scale cockpit mock-up with real instrumentation, the control stick and rudder pedals hydraulically connected to a visual projection system that replicated actual aircraft response under flight conditions. She stood in front of it for a long moment. "Can I try it?" she asked. "That's why we're here." She climbed in. He stood beside the simulator and walked her through the basic orientation, what each instrument read, what the control inputs did, how the visual system responded to stick movement. She listened to all of it before touching anything, which was a quality he recognized as his own and had apparently passed down without trying to. Then she put her hands on the controls. She was not immediately good at it. She overcorrected on her first input, and the visual horizon tilted sharply, and she made a sound of pure, startled laughter that echoed in the empty warehouse. She corrected back, overcorrected again. The aircraft, simulated, patient, indifferent, responded to every input without judgment. "It's harder than it looks," she said. "Everything is harder than it looks," he said. "Why does it keep tipping?" "Because you're trying to hold it with your wrist. It doesn't respond to force. It responds to pressure. There's a difference." She tried again. Light pressure, not grip. The horizon steadied. "Oh," she said. "Yeah." She flew for 40 minutes. Not well. Nobody flew well in 40 minutes, and the simulator knew no mercy for overcorrection. But with the specific quality of sustained attention that means someone is learning, that means the feedback is getting in and being processed and something is changing. When she climbed out, her face had the look of a person who has spent time with something genuinely difficult and not been defeated by it, which was different from the look of someone who'd had fun. It was more serious, more useful. "I want to come back," she said. "The foundation opens in 2 weeks. Before that, I'll see what I can do." She looked around the space again. The 4 simulators, the workshop benches with their component kits, the whiteboard wall along the south side that Priya had specified for collaborative working because she believed in visible thinking. The morning light came in through the high warehouse windows and spread across the concrete floor without drama, just steady and present. "Dad," Leia said. "Yeah. Was it like this when you first flew?" He thought about it. He thought about the first time he'd sat in a real cockpit. Not a simulator, a 2-seat trainer at a base in South Carolina, the summer he was 19, the instructor in the rear seat, the runway ahead, the specific quality of the light at 6 in the morning on a clear day when everything is very still before it is not still at all. "No," he said. It was less controlled and considerably more terrifying. She considered this. Better or worse? "Different," he said. "This is better for learning. That was better for—" He stopped, looked for the right word. "That was better for understanding what you were getting into." She nodded slowly, filing it. They locked up the space together and drove home, and she talked most of the way about the pressure sensitivity of the control inputs and what she thought could be done differently in the first lesson curriculum to explain it. And he listened and occasionally offered a correction, and it was one of the better drives he could remember. The foundation opened on a Thursday morning in April, which was not a Friday or a weekend because Ethan had argued that opening on a school day sent the right signal. That this was not a special occasion or a celebration, but the beginning of something ordinary and ongoing, something that would be there the way school was there, the way the bus ran. Veronica gave a short address to the first cohort of students, 22 kids, ages 12 to 16, drawn from 4 different schools in the surrounding area through a partnership the foundation had built with the district. She had written the speech herself, which he knew because she'd sent him a draft at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night with a note that said only, "Too long?" He'd written back, 3rd paragraph, Cut it. She'd cut it. She did not mention Vanguard's brand until the last sentence, and even then only to note that the company had provided resources, not that the company was doing the students a favor. The distinction was deliberate, and the students, most of whom had a finely calibrated sense for when they were being done a favor versus when they were being offered a genuine thing, noticed it. Then Ethan stood up. He hadn't written a speech. He stood at the front of the room, the workshop space, the kids on folding chairs, the simulators visible through the open door of the adjacent bay, and looked at 22 faces that were at various points on the spectrum between skeptical and curious, which was exactly the right range. "I'm going to tell you one thing," he said, "and then we're going to get to work." The room was quiet. The people who built the machines that changed how humanity understood distance and speed and what was possible, a lot of them didn't start in rooms like this. They started in whatever room was available to them. A garage, a field, a workshop with borrowed tools. What they had was not access. What they had was the specific kind of stubbornness that refuses to accept that not knowing something is the same as not being able to learn it. He paused. That's what this place is for. Not to give you access to things that were always someone else's. To give you the time and the tools and the people to figure out what you already have in you. That's a different thing. He looked at the room. "Okay," he said. "Let's go." They went. The first session was not smooth. Two of the kids had no interest in the simulators and were far more interested in the workshop bench where a disassembled turbine component sat waiting for the first lesson in mechanical systems, which was fine because there was no correct entry point, only the one that caught you. 3 of them broke things. One of the broken things was actually a useful failure because it demonstrated a principle Priya had been planning to introduce in week 3, which she moved to day 1 on the spot. One of the kids, a 13-year-old named Darius, who had come in with his arms crossed and the absolute posture of someone who had been disappointed by institutions before, spent the first 40 minutes silent in the back of the room, and then, when nobody was watching, got up and walked to the nearest simulator and sat in it and put his hands on the controls and didn't ask permission. Ethan saw it and didn't say anything. He watched Darius figure out, over the next 15 minutes, what Laia had figured out in her first session, that the aircraft didn't respond to force, that it responded to pressure, that there was a difference. He watched the moment Darius felt the horizon steady. He looked away before Darius could catch him watching, because some things need to be private to stay intact. Veronica found him at the end of the day, standing in the doorway between the workshop and the simulator bay, looking at the space after the students had gone. The afternoon light had gone long and amber. The folding chairs were still in their rough arrangement. Someone had left a notebook open on one of the workshop benches. "How do you think it went?" she asked. "Ask me in a year," he said. "I'm asking you now." He thought about it honestly. 3 of them are going to come back just to break things and see what happens. One of them is going to be here every day by the end of the month. 2 more are undecided. The rest are somewhere in between. He paused. "That's a good first day." She looked at the space, at the simulators, the benches, the whiteboard wall where someone had written, in marker, a badly spelled but structurally accurate definition of lift. "I've been running this company for 4 years," she said, "since my father died. I've made good decisions and bad ones. I've built things and I've held things together that were already in the process of falling apart." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't think I've built anything yet that felt like it was actually for someone else. Like the center of gravity was somewhere outside my own survival." Ethan looked at her. "This feels different," she said. "It is different," he said. "That's why it's harder." She nodded. They stood in the quiet of the empty room for a moment. Not uncomfortably, the way 2 people stand together when they've done something real and are letting the reality of it settle before they have to go back to the ordinary pace of things. "I owe you something," she said. "Beyond the role, the foundation. That's mutual, that's shared. I'm talking about the atrium. About Laia." She looked at him. "I'd like to apologize to her directly, if you'd allow it. Not for my sake. For hers. She's old enough to know that the people who treat her badly aren't beyond accountability, and I'd like her to see that in practice." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "She remembers," he said. "She doesn't talk about it, but she remembers." I know she does. He looked at Veronica, at the composed, controlled woman who had walked into the atrium 14 months ago with certainty, like armor, and who was now, in the long light of an April afternoon, offering something that cost her and doing it without hedging. Yeah, he said. Okay. She nodded. Shot. The apology happened on a Saturday at the foundation space when Ethan brought Leia for her second simulator session. Veronica was there when they arrived. Not staged, not formal, just there, which was the right way to do it. She crouched down to Leia's level, which Ethan noted she did without any self-consciousness, and she said, I said something unkind to you and your father a while ago, in the building. Do you remember? Leia looked at her. Yes. I was wrong to say it. I'm sorry. Not just to your dad. To you. Leia considered this for a moment with the unhurried seriousness she brought to things that deserved it. Okay, she said. Veronica waited in case there was more. There wasn't. Leia had accepted it and moved on in the way children do when an apology is genuine and complete, not with fanfare, not with a speech, just with the quiet acknowledgement that the thing had been addressed and was now in the past where it belonged. She looked at the simulators. Can I go in? She asked her father. Go ahead, he said. She went. Veronica stood up. She looked at Ethan. That's it? She said. That's how easy it is for her? She doesn't hold things to punish people, he said. She holds them until they're resolved. Then she lets go. He watched his daughter climb into the simulator. I've been trying to get better at that. Veronica watched too. She's extraordinary, she said quietly. I know, he said. And then, after a moment, she got it from her mother. Diana was the same way. Set things down when they were finished. I'm more the kind of person who carries things until my back gives out. It was the first time he'd mentioned Diana to anyone at Vanguard, and he wasn't entirely sure why he'd said it now. Maybe because it felt true, and he was in the habit of saying true things in this place. Where is she? Her mother? Veronica asked. I don't know exactly. She calls sometimes, not often. He paused. Leia handles it better than I do. Does that make you angry? Sometimes. He was quiet. Less than it used to. That spring, the Foundation took its first full cohort through the 8-week introductory program. Of the 22 students who started, 19 completed it. Of the 19, 11 enrolled in the second session. Darius, the 13-year-old who had sat with his arms crossed on the first day, became the student who stayed latest every Thursday. He had no interest in the simulators anymore. He wanted the workshop bench and the disassembled components and the particular problem of understanding how complex systems fail. He asked questions that were, occasionally, questions Ethan had to actually think about before answering, which was the best kind. The DoD liaison project moved forward. The testing protocol work that Ethan contributed to was narrow and technical and would not produce visible results for another 2 or 3 years, which was the timescale of serious work and which he had made his peace with. Catherine Ashe proved to be exactly what she'd seemed in their first conversation. Direct, organized, and committed to keeping the scheduling arrangement intact. She had not once in 6 months allowed a meeting to run past 3 o'clock on a school day. He'd started to wonder if she had a kid of her own. He hadn't asked. He would, eventually. Kowalski retired in June with a send-off in the engineering bay that involved mediocre sheet cake and a great deal of genuine feeling. He shook Ethan's hand at the end of the evening with the same brief, firm grip as always and said, "You're the best thing that came out of this whole mess, you know that?" Ethan said he didn't know that. Kowalski said, "Well, it's true anyway," and left. Marcus got a promotion to lead engineer on the next generation development track, which Ethan had seen coming for 8 months and had quietly mentioned to Director Chen 6 weeks before Chen mentioned it independently, which confirmed what Ethan had believed. That the good outcomes happen when the right person is in the right position and someone with a clear view takes the time to say so. In September, a full year after the demo failure, Vanguard held its second public demonstration of the Apex 7. The engine had been rebuilt, not rebuilt, incorporating the combustion liner redesign and the revised testing protocol that had come out of the post-incident work. It was a quieter event than the first one. smaller press presence, more focused military and procurement attendants, no catering van, no folding chairs on an observation platform. Ethan watched from the test cell floor this time. He stood with the engineering team at the monitoring stations in a regular sweater, no uniform, and watched the data panels with the same attention he'd brought to every engine he'd ever stood next to. The Apex 7 ran clean, all the way through, every stage handing off to the next. The thrust curve followed the projection without significant variance. The inner liner temperature held steady. The fuel management assembly performed within tolerance at every load level. It ran for 47 minutes under sustained operational simulation. When the shutdown sequence completed and the engine went quiet, the test cell was briefly silent in the way that spaces go silent after something that has been very loud stops. Then Priya, who was at the station to his left, exhaled and said, "Okay?" And Chen to his right nodded once. And someone at the back of the room started clapping, and a few others joined, and it was not a dramatic or prolonged moment, but it was a real one. Ethan looked at the engine. He'd been in the room when this machine almost destroyed itself. He'd helped rebuild the understanding of why. He'd watched the people around him learn from the failure in ways that made the rebuilt machine better than the original, which was what failure was supposed to do if you let it. He thought about a 37 failure test engine in a 1987 photograph. He thought about what it meant to keep going anyway. He didn't say any of this out loud. There was no need. He picked Leia up at 3:15. She was waiting on the school steps with her backpack and a drawing she'd made in art class that she wanted to show him before they got to the car, which meant standing on the sidewalk in the September wind while she unfolded it carefully and held it out. It was an aircraft. Her design, the hybrid one she'd been refining since she was 8. It had changed substantially over the past year. The proportions were more considered. The engine placement was correct. The control surface design was not standard, but it was not random either. She'd been thinking about it, working through problems on her own, arriving at solutions that sometimes required him to think before he could evaluate them. "Better," he said. "The intake geometry is still wrong," she said. "A little." "I know, I'm working on it." He folded the drawing carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, which was where the important things went when his hands were full. They walked to the car. She talked about her day. He listened. The September light went long and warm across the rooftops. He thought about the year behind him, about the mop bucket and the broken wheel, about the atrium and the woman who had stood over his daughter and the look on Leia's face afterward, about the walkway above the test cell and the data panel and the moment a shape resolved out of noise, about fire and smoke and a young engineer's weight across his shoulders, about a tattoo and a woman recognizing in it something she'd been carrying for years, about a warehouse full of folding chairs and 22 kids who hadn't been given much and were deciding what to do about that. He thought about his father, who had been a mechanic and who had told him, when he was about Leia's age, that the difference between someone who fixes things and someone who just works on things is whether they listen to what the machine is telling them before they start taking it apart. His father had been talking about engines. He'd been right about more than engines. He thought about what you lose when a career ends and the long, slow work of discovering that the capacity doesn't go with it, that the thing you built over years of discipline and risk and hard learning doesn't disappear when the external structure falls away, that it lives in your hands and your nervous system and the way you hear a sound and know before you think about it what the sound means. He thought about the version of himself that had applied for a grade 3 facilities position 14 months ago, not because he believed it was where he was supposed to end up, but because it was where he could be present for his daughter while he figured out the next thing. And he thought that the instinct had been right in ways he hadn't fully understood when he'd followed it. That presence, consistency, the willingness to do the work in front of you without waiting for the work to be worthy of you, these were not compromises. They were the foundation. You couldn't build from nowhere. He thought about Veronica Pierce, who was at this moment probably in her 4th floor office doing whatever CEOs do at 3:15 on a Wednesday, and who had become, in the past year, something he hadn't expected. Not a friend exactly, but a person he genuinely respected and occasionally understood better than she understood herself, which she would probably agree with and possibly resent a little. She was still difficult. She was less afraid of her own difficulty than she used to be. That was a real change, and real changes were worth something. He thought about Reyes, who had come back to the Apex 7 team after his injury and who had stopped by Ethan's desk one morning in July and said simply and directly, "I think about that day a lot." Ethan had said, "So do I." Reyes had said, "Thank you." Ethan had said, "Don't thank me. Build better." Reyes had laughed, a little surprised. He'd said, "Yeah, okay." And he'd gone back to his desk, and that had been the whole conversation, and it had been enough. "Dad?" Leia said. "Yeah." "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her. She was watching him with the two large eyes that caught everything and gave back only what she chose to. "The intake geometry on your aircraft," he said. She narrowed her eyes. "You're lying." "I'm not lying. I'm also thinking about other things." "Like what?" He unlocked the car. "Get in. I'll tell you on the way home." She got in. He got in. He started the car. He told her about the day and the engine and the test that ran clean. He told her about Priya's exhaled okay and the brief silence before the clapping. He told her that the machine they'd been working on for a year had finally done what it was supposed to do, and that this was not a small thing, and that she should understand it as not a small thing, because the work of making complicated systems work as intended was slow and difficult and unglamorous and mattered enormously. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Is it the best engine you've ever worked on?" He thought about the aircraft he'd flown, about the twin engine going down over the North Pacific, about the sound of the Apex 7 at 47 minutes of sustained thrust, clean and steady. "Not yet," he said, "but it's going to be." She looked out the window at the passing city, the buildings, the sky going amber at the edges, the ordinary and ongoing world. "Good," she said. He drove home. The radiator would click on when they got there. He'd make dinner. She'd spread her drawings across the table and work on the intake geometry while the food cooked, and she'd call out questions, and he'd answer them from the kitchen. The window above the sink would show the last of the daylight, and somewhere in the middle distance, a commuter aircraft would be on its approach, wheels down, steady on its line. He would hear it. He would know what it was without looking, and he would keep cooking,